The morning mist clung to Millbrook's cobblestone streets like secrets waiting to be told. In this small Pennsylvania town where everyone knew everyone else's business, 12-year-old Thomas Bradley had learned that being nobody meant being invisible. What he didn't know was that one act of kindness by the old stone bridge would change everything, not just for him, but for an entire town that had forgotten what honor truly meant. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Bradley pressed his face against the frost-covered window of Henderson's general store, watching the warm light spill across barrels of flour and bolts of fabric. His breath fogged the glass as he counted the coins in his pocket for the third time. 17 cents. Not enough for the loaf of bread he'd been eyeing, but enough for the day-old biscuits Mrs. Henderson sometimes sold at half price. The bell above the door chimed as customers entered and left, their voices mixing with the creak of wooden floors and the rustle of paper packages. Thomas waited. He always waited until the store was nearly empty. It was easier that way. Fewer stares, fewer whispered comments about that orphan boy from the workhouse. Millbrook, Pennsylvania, in the autumn of 1887, was a town built on iron and coal, where the wealthy lived in grand houses on Maple Hill and the poor worked 16-hour shifts at the foundry. Thomas belonged to neither world. The Millbrook workhouse sat at the edge of town like a gray afterthought, housing children whose parents had died in mining accidents, factory fires, or simply from the exhaustion of trying to survive. Mrs. Agnes Whitmore, the workhouse matron, wasn't cruel exactly, but she wasn't kind either. She fed them thin porridge and assigned them chores that kept their hands busy and their hopes quiet. Thomas had been there since he was 7, when scarlet fever took both his parents within a week of each other. 5 years later, he'd learned to make himself small, to work without complaint, and to dream in whispers. The store finally emptied except for Mrs. Henderson, a round woman with graying hair who counted her till with methodical precision. Thomas pushed open the door, and the bell announced his presence with what felt like unnecessary enthusiasm. "Thomas Bradley," Mrs. Henderson said without looking up. "Right on time. I've got 2 biscuits left from yesterday. 10 cents for both." "Thank you, ma'am." Thomas placed the coins on the counter with careful reverence. Mrs. Henderson had never been unkind to him, but she'd never been particularly warm either. In Millbrook, charity was measured in careful doses. She wrapped the biscuits in brown paper and handed them across the counter. "How's Mrs. Whitmore treating you children?" "Fine, ma'am. We're managing well enough." Mrs. Henderson studied his thin frame and the careful way he tucked the precious package into his coat. "You're a good boy, Thomas. Don't let anyone tell you different." The words caught him off guard. Kindness, when it came at all, usually felt like an accident. "Thank you, ma'am." Outside, the October air bit at his cheeks as he hurried down Main Street. The workhouse expected him back by supper, but he had an hour to himself, a rare gift. Thomas often spent these precious moments by Willow Creek, where the old stone bridge connected the town proper to the farmlands beyond. It was quiet there, peaceful, and nobody bothered with a boy sitting alone by the water. The bridge was older than the town itself, built by settlers who'd needed to cross the creek to reach fertile ground. Made of gray stone worn smooth by decades of weather, it arched gracefully over water that ran clear and cold, fed by mountain springs that never seemed to run dry. Thomas had claimed a spot beneath the eastern arch, where he could watch the water flow and pretend he was somewhere else entirely. As he approached his usual refuge, Thomas noticed something unusual. A figure sat hunched on the bridge's center span, silhouetted against the afternoon sky. A woman, judging by the long skirt and shawl, though something about her posture suggested pain or exhaustion. Thomas hesitated. The bridge was public property, of course, but he'd never shared it with anyone before. Still, something about the woman's stillness troubled him. She hadn't moved since he'd first spotted her from Main Street. Drawing closer, he could see she was young, perhaps 18 or 19, with auburn hair that had escaped its pins and hung in tangled waves around her shoulders. Her dress, once fine, was now muddy and torn at the hem. Most striking of all was the way she favored her left leg, keeping it straight and rigid, while her right foot dangled freely over the bridge's edge. She was beautiful in the way. Autumn leaves were beautiful, touched with something both vibrant and fragile, as if a strong wind might carry her away entirely. "Miss?" Thomas called softly, not wanting to startle her. "Are you all right?" She turned, and Thomas saw eyes the color of deep forest shade, bright with unshed tears. Her face was pale, exhausted, but when she saw him, she attempted a smile that didn't quite reach those troubled eyes. "I'm fine, thank you," she said, though her voice carried the weight of someone who was anything but fine. "Just resting a moment." Thomas stepped closer, noting the way she gripped the bridge's stone railing. "You're hurt." It wasn't a question. Thomas had spent 5 years learning to read the subtle signs of pain, the careful way people moved when they were injured, the particular set of shoulders that meant someone was fighting tears. The woman girl really looked away. "It's nothing serious. I just need to cross the creek, but ... She gestured helplessly at the water below. Thomas followed her gaze. Willow Creek wasn't particularly wide or deep, but the recent autumn rains had swollen it beyond its usual gentle flow. The current moved with purpose now, carrying leaves and small branches downstream. For someone with an injured leg, crossing would be treacherous. "Where are you trying to go?" Thomas asked. "The farmlands past the bridge. I have family there." Something in her voice suggested this wasn't entirely true, but Thomas had learned not to press when people guarded their secrets. Everyone in Millbrook had reasons for keeping certain truths to themselves. "I could help you," he offered without thinking. She looked at him then, really looked, taking in his worn clothes and careful manner. "You're very kind, but I couldn't ask that of you. You're just a boy." "I'm 12, Thomas said with all the dignity he could muster, "and I know this creek better than anyone. I've been crossing it since I was 8. This was true. Thomas had spent countless hours exploring the creek's banks, learning where the current was strongest, where hidden rocks made footing treacherous, and where the water ran shallow enough to wade safely across. The young woman studied his earnest face. "What's your name?" "Thomas Bradley, miss. I live at the workhouse in town." Something flickered across her features, recognition, perhaps, or sympathy. "I'm Sarah," she said simply. "Sarah Collins." Thomas noticed she hadn't offered her full story, but he didn't press. "Miss Collins, if you're willing to trust me, I can get you across safely. The water's running high, but there's a shallow crossing about 50 yards downstream. The current's gentler there." Sarah looked toward the farmlands beyond the bridge, then back at Thomas. Whatever had brought her here, whatever she was running from or toward, it was important enough that she was willing to accept help from a 12-year-old orphan. "All right," she said quietly. "But if the crossing looks too dangerous, we turn back. I won't have you hurt on my account." Thomas felt a warmth spread through his chest, the unfamiliar sensation of being trusted with something important. "Yes, miss. I promise we'll be careful." He helped her stand, noting how she bit her lip against the pain as she put weight on her injured leg. Whatever had happened to her, it was recent and severe. Still, she managed to walk, leaning heavily on Thomas's shoulder as they made their way down the creek bank. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees, casting dancing shadows on the water. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed 4 o'clock. Thomas should have been heading back to the workhouse soon, but this felt more important than punctuality. As they reached the shallow crossing, Thomas studied the water with practiced eyes. The current was swift but manageable, the bottom visible through the clear water. Rounded stones provided decent footing, though they'd be slippery. The key, Thomas explained, rolling up his trouser legs, is to move with the current, not against it. And always keep 2 points of contact. If one foot slips, the other should be secure. Sarah gathered her skirts as best she could with one hand, keeping the other on Thomas's shoulder. You sound like you've done this before. Many times, miss. Sometimes it's faster than going around by the main road. Thomas stepped into the water, gasping slightly at the cold. Take your time. There's no rush. Step by careful step, they made their way across. Sarah's injured leg made the crossing slow and precarious, but Thomas proved as steady as he'd promised. When her foot slipped on a moss-covered stone, he caught her arm and helped her regain her balance. When the current seemed too strong, he found alternate routes around the deeper pools. Halfway across, Sarah paused, breathing hard. Thomas, why are you helping me? You don't know anything about me. The question caught him off guard. In truth, he wasn't entirely sure himself. I suppose because you needed help. And because nobody's ever needed my help before. Sarah looked at him with something that might have been wonder. You're remarkable, you know that? Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks. Remarkable wasn't a word anyone had ever applied to him before. Quiet, obedient, forgettable. Those were the adjectives that usually followed his name. They completed the crossing in silence, Thomas helping Sarah up the far bank where she collapsed gratefully onto a fallen log. Her breathing was labored, and fresh tears leaked from the corners of her eyes. Miss Collins, Thomas said gently, your leg needs proper attention. There's a doctor in town, Dr. Morrison. He's a good man. No, Sarah said quickly. No doctors, no town. I just need to rest. Thomas didn't understand her fear, but he recognized it. All right. But you shouldn't be alone out here with that injury. At least let me bring you some supplies, food, blankets, medicine if I can manage it. Sarah shook her head. You've done enough, more than enough. I can't ask you to. You're not asking, Thomas interrupted. I'm offering. They looked at each other across the growing shadows, this injured young woman and the orphan boy who'd helped her cross a swollen creek. Something passed between them, not words but understanding. There's an old hunting cabin about a quarter-mile through those trees, Sarah said finally, pointing toward a copse of oak and maple. If it's still standing, I could shelter there for a few days. Thomas nodded. I know the one. It's been abandoned for years, but the roof's still good. I'll bring what I can tomorrow. Thomas, Sarah said as he prepared to leave, why do I get the feeling you're more than just a helpful boy from the workhouse? The question puzzled him. I'm nothing special, miss. Just Thomas Bradley. But as he waded back across the creek alone, he carried Sarah's words with him. For the first time in his life, someone had seen something in him worth remarking upon. Someone had trusted him with their safety, their secrets, their gratitude. What Thomas didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that his simple act of kindness had set in motion events that would shake Millbrook to its foundations. Sarah Collins was not who she appeared to be, and the injured maid who'd needed help crossing the creek carried secrets that would soon bring 30 armed warriors to their quiet Pennsylvania town, but that revelation lay hours away, hidden in the approaching darkness, like a storm that hadn't yet announced itself with thunder. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas returned to the Millbrook workhouse as the dinner bell clanged across the courtyard, its iron voice calling 23 children to their evening meal of watery soup and hard bread. He slipped through the back entrance, hoping to avoid Mrs. Whitmore's sharp eyes, but luck wasn't with him. Thomas Bradley. Her voice cut through the chatter of hungry children like a blade through silk. You're late. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry. Ma'am. Thomas kept his eyes down, a skill perfected over 5 years of institutional living. Agnes Whitmore stood 6 feet tall in her sensible boots. A woman built like the iron foundries that fed Millbrook's economy, all angles and unyielding. Strength. Her gray hair was pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch the skin around her pale eyes, and her mouth rarely formed any expression softer than disapproval. "Where were you?" "At Henderson's store, ma'am. Then I walked by the creek." Both statements were true, though they hardly told the whole story. Mrs. Whitmore studied him with the intensity of someone accustomed to extracting confessions from children who'd learned that honesty was often punished as severely as lies. "The creek, was it? And what did you find so fascinating about muddy water that it made you forget your obligations here?" Thomas felt the weight of 22 pairs of eyes watching this familiar theater. In the workhouse, individual punishment served as group entertainment and collective warning. "Nothing special, ma'am. I just lost track of time." "Time," Mrs. Whitmore repeated, savoring the word like something distasteful. "Time is a luxury, Thomas Bradley. Children in your position don't have the privilege of losing track of anything." She gestured toward the long wooden table where the other children sat with their tin bowls and wooden spoons. "Take your place. Your soup is cold, but you'll eat it anyway." Thomas nodded and hurried to the only empty spot between 9-year-old Rebecca Chun, whose parents had died in a tenement fire, and 14-year-old Marcus Johnson, who'd been at the workhouse longer than anyone except Mrs. Whitmore herself. The soup was indeed cold, a thin broth with occasional flecks of potato floating like afterthoughts. Thomas ate mechanically, his mind still by the creek with Sarah Collins and her mysterious need to avoid doctors and towns. Something about her story didn't align properly, like puzzle pieces that almost fit but left tiny gaps around the edges. "You look different," Rebecca whispered beside him. At 9, she possessed the uncanny ability of children to notice things adults missed. "Something happened today." Thomas glanced around to ensure Mrs. Whitmore wasn't listening. The matron had moved to the far end of the room, supervising the distribution of evening chores. "What do you mean?" "Your face," Rebecca insisted. "You look like you have a secret." Marcus leaned closer, his voice barely audible. "Did you find treasure by the creek? Gold coins? A dead body?" "Nothing like that," Thomas said, though he wondered if helping Sarah Collins might prove more dangerous than finding a corpse. Just ... met someone who needed help. This was true enough, but it seemed to satisfy neither Rebecca nor Marcus. The two exchanged glances that suggested they'd revisit this topic when Mrs. Whitmore wasn't within earshot. After dinner, the children were assigned their evening tasks: washing dishes, sweeping floors, mending clothes by candlelight. Thomas drew wood-splitting duty, which meant an hour in the courtyard with an axe and a pile of logs destined for the workhouse's perpetually hungry stoves. The physical work felt good after the day's strange encounters. Thomas had always found comfort in tasks that required nothing more than rhythm and strength. Split, stack, a meditation that quieted his racing thoughts and tired his restless body. As he worked, Thomas began planning. Sarah Collins needed supplies, and he promised to bring them. But workhouse children owned nothing beyond the clothes on their backs and whatever meager possessions fit in the wooden box under their beds. How could he help someone when he had nothing to give? The answer came to him as he stacked the last of the split wood. Thomas might own nothing, but he had access to things that wouldn't be missed, at least not immediately. The workhouse kept emergency supplies in a locked pantry: bandages, simple medicines, dried foods intended for times when deliveries from town were delayed by weather or circumstance. Mrs. Whitmore kept the key, but Thomas had watched her enough times to know she kept it on a ring attached to her belt during the day and hung on a nail beside her bedroom door at night. The door was never locked. What was the point when the children were confined to the dormitory after 8 o'clock? It was stealing, Thomas acknowledged. But was it really theft to take supplies that would otherwise sit unused while someone suffered? The workhouse had more bandages than they'd used in the past year, And the dried beef in the pantry had been there so long it was probably older than some of the children. Thomas had never stolen anything in his life. Even during his hungriest days, even when the temptation to pocket something from Henderson's store had been almost overwhelming, he'd resisted. But this felt different. This was about helping someone who needed help, not about personal gain. As the other children settled into their evening routines, the younger ones listening to Rebecca read from a battered copy of fairy tales. The older ones playing quiet games of cards or checkers. Thomas lay on his narrow cot and refined his plan. Mrs. Whitmore made her rounds at 9:30, checking each bed and ensuring no one was awake past the official bedtime. She'd retired to her own room by 10 o'clock, and by 10:30, the workhouse would be as quiet as it ever got. If Thomas could slip out then, retrieve the supplies, and return before dawn, no one would know he'd been gone. The risks were substantial. If Mrs. Whitmore discovered him missing, he'd face punishment severe enough to make him regret ever hearing the name Sarah Collins. Worse, if she discovered supplies missing from the pantry, she might blame one of the other children. Thomas couldn't bear the thought of Rebecca or Marcus suffering for his choices, but then he remembered Sarah's face as she'd looked at him across the creek, not with the careful politeness adults usually showed workhouse children, but with genuine gratitude and something that might have been respect. No one had ever looked at Thomas Bradley that way before. The decision made itself at 10:45. When the workhouse had settled into its familiar nighttime sounds, Mrs. Whitmore's snoring from behind her closed door, the whistle of wind through loose window frames, the occasional creak of old wood settling, Thomas slipped from his bed. He'd practiced this route during previous sleepless nights, memorizing which floorboards creaked and which doorways offered the quietest passage. Moving like smoke through the darkened hallways, Thomas reached Mrs. Whitmore's door and carefully lifted the key ring from its nail. The pantry lock turned with barely a whisper. Inside, Thomas found exactly what he'd hoped for: rolls of clean bandages, a small bottle of carbolic acid for cleaning wounds, dried beef wrapped in brown paper, a tin of crackers, and even a small jar of honey that would provide quick energy. He took only what could reasonably be missed, not enough to create obvious gaps on the shelves, but sufficient to help Sarah through several days of recovery. Thomas wrapped everything in a spare pillowcase from the linen closet and retraced his path to Mrs. Whitmore's door. Replacing the keys proved more nerve-wracking than taking them. His hands shook slightly as he hung the ring back on its nail. And for one terrible moment, he thought the metal might jangle loudly enough to wake the matron. But Mrs. Whitmore's snoring continued uninterrupted, and Thomas made it back to his bed without incident. He lay awake for the rest of the night, the stolen supplies hidden beneath his mattress, his mind racing with anticipation and anxiety. What if Sarah was gone when he returned to the creek? What if her injury had worsened? What if someone else had found her? Worse, what if she really was running from something dangerous? Thomas had lived in Millbrook long enough to know that trouble often found people who tried to help others. But he'd also learned that doing nothing when someone needed help was its own kind of danger, the kind that ate at your soul until you forgot what it felt like to be fully human. Dawn came slowly, creeping through the workhouse windows like a reluctant visitor. Thomas lay still until he heard Mrs. Whitmore moving about her morning routine, then rose with the other children for another day of carefully scheduled survival. Breakfast was porridge and weak coffee. Morning chores included sweeping the dormitory and helping with laundry. Thomas moved through these familiar tasks with unusual energy, sustained by the knowledge that he had something important to do, someone who needed him. At 11 o'clock, Mrs. Whitmore announced that she needed to visit the town clerk's office on official business. She'd be gone until after lunch, leaving the older children to supervise the younger ones. This was exactly the opportunity Thomas had hoped for. "Marcus," Thomas said quietly as Mrs. Whitmore departed, "I need to run an errand. Can you cover For me if anyone asks. Marcus studied his friend's face with the shrewd expression of someone who'd learned to read people's motivations for survival. This about that secret Rebecca noticed yesterday? Maybe. You're not in trouble, are you? Because if Mrs. Whitmore finds out, she won't, Thomas said with more confidence than he felt. I'll be back before she returns. Marcus nodded slowly. All right, but Thomas, whatever you're doing, be careful. People in this town don't like it when workhouse children get involved in things that aren't their business. Thomas retrieved the hidden supplies and slipped out through the kitchen door, while the other children were occupied with their morning lessons. The walk to Willow Creek felt longer than usual, weighted by the precious cargo he carried and the growing certainty that he was crossing a line from which there might be no return. The old hunting cabin sat exactly where Sarah had described it, hidden among maple trees whose leaves had turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Smoke drifted from the chimney, a good sign that suggested Sarah had managed to start a fire and was likely conscious and mobile. Thomas knocked softly on the weathered door. Miss Collins? It's Thomas Bradley. The door opened slowly, revealing Sarah's pale face. She looked exhausted but alert, and Thomas was relieved to see that her color had improved since the previous day. She'd managed to clean most of the mud from her dress and had braided her auburn hair back from her face. Thomas, she said, and her voice carried a warmth that made his chest tight with unfamiliar emotion. I wasn't sure you'd come back. I promised I would, Thomas said simply, offering her the pillowcase full of supplies. Sarah's eyes widened as she examined the contents. This is ... this is wonderful. But Thomas, where did you get all this? These are expensive items. Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks. I took them from the workhouse pantry. I know it's stealing, but they have more than they need, and you stole these for me? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Yes, miss. I'm sorry if that makes you think less of me. But, think less of you? Sarah shook her head slowly. Thomas Bradley, I'm beginning to think you're the most extraordinary person I've ever met. The word extraordinary hit Thomas like a physical blow. In his 12 years of life, no one had ever described him as anything more remarkable than adequate or well-behaved. But here was this beautiful, mysterious young woman calling him extraordinary for doing what felt like the most natural thing in the world. Miss Collins, Thomas said carefully, I don't mean to pry, but are you in some kind of trouble? Because if you are, maybe I could help with more than just supplies. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing whether to trust him with something far more dangerous than crossing a creek. Finally, she stepped aside and gestured for him to enter the cabin. Thomas, she said quietly, what I'm about to tell you might put you in danger. Are you sure you want to know? Thomas thought of the workhouse, of Mrs. Whitmore's cold eyes, and the endless days of gray routine stretching ahead of him. He thought of Rebecca and Marcus and all the other children who'd learned to keep their heads down and their hopes small. Then he looked at Sarah Collins, who'd called him extraordinary, and made his choice. Yes, miss. I want to know. Sarah Collins closed the cabin door behind Thomas and moved to the small window, peering through the gaps in the wooden shutters as if expecting to see armed men emerging from the forest. The caution in her movements told Thomas that whatever secret she carried, it was the kind that could get people killed. Sit down, she said softly, gesturing to one of two rough wooden chairs that comprised the cabin's meager furniture. What I'm about to tell you sounds like something from Rebecca's fairy tale books, but I swear to you it's true. Thomas settled into the chair, his heart hammering against his ribs. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and autumn leaves, with an underlying mustiness that spoke of years of abandonment. A small fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across Sarah's face as she began to speak. My name isn't Sarah Collins, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's Sarah Blackfeather, and I'm the daughter of Chief Standing Bear of the Lakota Nation. Thomas felt the world tilt sideways. In 1887 Pennsylvania, the Indian Wars were still fresh in everyone's memory. Newspapers regularly carried stories of conflicts out west, of cavalry charges and burning settlements, of savage raids and heroic last stands. The idea that he'd help the daughter of an Indian chief cross Willow Creek seemed impossible. "I know what you're thinking," Sarah continued, noting his expression. "You're wondering how the daughter of a Lakota chief learned to speak English without an accent. Why I'm dressed like a white woman. Why I'm here instead of on a reservation. Somewhere in Dakota Territory." Thomas nodded mutely, unable to form words. Sarah moved to the fireplace, staring into the flames as she continued. "When I was 8 years old, my father made an agreement with the U.S. government. They wanted to educate selected Indian children in white schools, to civilize us, as they put it. In exchange, they promised better conditions for our people on the reservation. More food, medical supplies, protection from the cavalry units that kept encroaching on our land." She paused, her hands gripping the rough mantelpiece. "My father chose me to go. Not because he wanted to lose his daughter, but because he believed education was the only weapon that might save our people in the long run. If some of us learned to speak like whites, to think like whites, to navigate their legal systems and political structures, maybe we could protect what was left of our world." Thomas found his voice. "Where did you go to school?" "Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania," Sarah said. "Perhaps you've heard of it. Captain Richard Pratt's grand experiment in cultural elimination. Kill the Indian, save the man, that was their motto." Thomas had indeed heard of Carlisle. The school was famous throughout Pennsylvania, often cited as an example of progressive thinking about Indian education. But Sarah's voice carried a bitterness that suggested the reality was far different from the newspaper accounts. "They cut my hair," Sarah continued, touching the auburn locks that now framed her face. "They burned my traditional clothes. They forbade me to speak Lakota, even in private. They gave me English books and a Christian name and told me to forget everything I'd ever known about being Indian." She turned from the fire to face Thomas directly. "For 6 years, I learned to be white. I studied literature and mathematics and piano. I learned to curtsy and to serve tea and to speak like the daughters of Pennsylvania businessmen. And slowly, I began to forget the sound of my father's voice, the smell of sweetgrass, the feeling of belonging to something larger than myself." Thomas could see pain in her eyes, not the physical pain of her injured leg, but something deeper and more fundamental. "What happened? Why are you here now?" 3 weeks ago, I received word that my father was dying," Sarah said. "Pneumonia, brought on by conditions on the reservation. The government had reduced food rations again, and many of our people were starving. My father had been trying to negotiate with the Indian agent for better supplies when he fell ill." She moved back to her chair, wincing as she put weight on her injured leg. "I left Carlisle without permission. In their eyes, that makes me a runaway, subject to pursuit and forcible return. But I had to see my father before ... Her voice caught. "Before it was too late. Did you make it to him?" Sarah's smile was sad and beautiful. "I did. He was so weak I barely recognized him, but his eyes were exactly as I remembered. When he saw me, he whispered my real name, Winona, which means firstborn daughter in our language. I hadn't heard it in 6 years." Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of loss that resonated with his own orphan state. "What did he tell you?" "That he was proud of me for learning the white man's ways, but that it was time to remember who I really was. He said our people needed leaders who could walk in both worlds, who understood white law and politics but hadn't forgotten the old ways." Sarah reached into her dress and withdrew something that made Thomas's breath catch. It was a medallion. Unlike anything he'd ever seen, silver worked with intricate designs that seemed to shift and flow in the firelight. At its center was a bear carved from what looked like black obsidian, surrounded by symbols Thomas couldn't read but somehow found beautiful. "This belonged to my grandfather and his grandfather before him," Sarah explained. "It marks the bearer. As a voice of the people, someone authorized to speak and act on behalf of the tribe. My father gave it to me 3 days before he died." "He died?" Thomas's voice was barely a whisper. "2 weeks ago," Sarah confirmed. "But before he passed, he told me something that changes everything. The government has been lying about the conditions on our reservation. They've been selling our land to mining companies, cutting our food supplies to force people to leave, and covering it up with false reports to Washington." She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "My father gathered evidence, contracts, correspondence, witness statements from our people. He hid it all and told me where to find it. That evidence could expose the corruption and save what's left of our homeland." Thomas was beginning to understand the magnitude of what Sarah had shared with him. "But getting the evidence means going back to the reservation, which I can't do alone," Sarah said. "The Indian agent knows my father suspected something. If I show up asking questions, I'll disappear quietly and the evidence will be destroyed." "So what's your plan?" Sarah's smile was grim. "That's where things get complicated. My father didn't just give me the medallion and the location of the evidence. He also sent word to our allies, other tribes who've been fighting the same battles. Influential white sympathizers who believe in Indian rights, even some government officials who aren't part of the corruption." She paused, as if weighing how much more to reveal. "When I left the reservation, my father told me that help would come. 30 of our finest warriors, led by my cousin Joseph Running Wolf, were to meet me in Pennsylvania and escort me safely to Washington, where the evidence could be presented to honest officials." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. 30 warriors coming here? "They should arrive any day now," Sarah confirmed. "My father arranged for them to travel in small groups, avoiding the main roads, staying away from military posts. They'll converge somewhere near Millbrook and then find me." The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. 30 Indian warriors arriving in a small Pennsylvania town would cause panic beyond anything Millbrook had ever experienced. The local militia would mobilize. Telegraph messages would fly to state authorities. Federal troops might be called in. "Miss Winona," Thomas said carefully, "do you understand what will happen when 30 armed Indians appear near Millbrook? People will think it's a raid. They'll shoot first and ask questions later." "I know," Sarah said quietly. "That's why I needed to hide until they arrived. My injured leg made me slower than planned, and I've been trying to stay out of sight until Joseph finds me." "How did you hurt your leg?" Sarah's expression darkened. 3 nights ago, I was sleeping in an abandoned barn about 10 miles east of here. 2 men found me, bounty hunters, I think, looking for the reward Carlisle offers for returned runaways. I tried to run, but I caught my foot in a rabbit hole and heard something snap." She gestured to her left leg. "I managed to get away. They weren't expecting a civilized Indian girl to fight back quite so hard, but the injury slowed me down. I've been making my way toward Millbrook ever since, hoping to find the meeting point before Joseph and his men give up looking for me." Thomas's mind raced through the possibilities, none of them good. "Where are you supposed to meet them?" "The old stone bridge over Willow Creek," Sarah said. "My father told Joseph to look for the bridge where white settlers first crossed the water. He said it was a place where 2 worlds touched, which seemed appropriate for what we're trying to accomplish." The irony wasn't lost on Thomas. He'd been sitting under that very bridge when Sarah first appeared, and now it was destined to become the focal point of something that could change everything for Millbrook. "When are they supposed to arrive?" "Any time now," Sarah admitted. "Joseph was traveling with the advance group, and they should have reached this area yesterday or today. If they don't find me soon, They'll assume something has gone wrong and proceed to the backup plan, which is... Sarah's smile was humorless. They enter the town openly and demand to speak with local authorities about a missing member of their party. It's within their rights under federal law, but 30 Indians riding into Millbrook demanding anything will start a war, Thomas finished. Exactly, which is why I need to reach that bridge and signal them before they take more direct action. Thomas looked at Sarah's injured leg, then at the approaching darkness outside the cabin windows. You can't walk 10 miles on that leg, especially not at night. I know, but I have to try. Too much depends on it. Thomas felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. Everything about this situation screamed danger, not just for Sarah, but for everyone in Millbrook. 30 warriors arriving unexpectedly in a town that barely tolerated its own small population of freed slaves, and Irish immigrants would create chaos that could end in bloodshed. But looking at Sarah, this remarkable young woman who'd been torn between two worlds, who carried the hopes of her people and the responsibility of exposing government corruption, Thomas knew he couldn't let her face this alone. I have an idea, he said slowly. But you're not going to like it. Tell me. We get you to the bridge tonight, but not on foot. I know someone who might help us, someone with a wagon and horses. But it means involving another person in this. And it means trusting someone from town. Sarah studied his face carefully. Who? Dr. Morrison, Thomas said. He's the town doctor, and he's different from most folks in Millbrook. He's helped people before when others wouldn't, miners injured in accidents the company didn't want to admit, children from the workhouse when Mrs. Whitmore would rather save money than treat sickness. A white doctor, Sarah said skeptically. Why would he help an Indian? Because, Thomas said with more confidence than he felt, Dr. Morrison believes in helping people, period. He's never asked me about my parents or my prospects or whether I could pay for treatment. He just helps when help is needed. Sarah was quiet for several minutes, staring into the fire while she weighed the risks. Finally, she nodded. All right, Thomas Bradley. I'll trust your judgment. But if this goes wrong, it won't, Thomas interrupted, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. As they prepared to leave the cabin, Sarah carefully secured the medallion around her neck and gathered the few possessions she'd carried with her. Thomas helped her wrap the supplies he'd brought in a bundle she could carry easily. Thomas, she said as they prepared to step into the night, why are you doing this? You could be hurt or killed or sent away from the only home you've known. Why risk all that for someone you just met? Thomas thought about the question seriously. It wasn't just kindness that drove him, though that was part of it. It wasn't just the excitement of being involved in something important, though that was part of it too. I think, he said slowly, it's because for the first time in my life, someone needs me to be brave instead of just obedient, and maybe this is what I was meant to do. Sarah smiled, and in that smile, Thomas saw something that looked remarkably like pride. Your parents would be proud of you, Thomas Bradley. So would yours, Thomas replied, and meant it. As they stepped into the Pennsylvania night, neither of them knew that 30 miles away, Joseph Running Wolf and his warriors had already reached the outskirts of Millbrook, or that Dr. Morrison was about to face a choice that would test everything he believed about medicine, morality, and the meaning of civilization. The pieces were moving toward collision, and at the center of it all was a 12-year-old orphan who'd helped a limping maid cross a creek and discovered that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could change the course of history. Dr. Ezra Morrison lived in a white clapboard house on Elm Street, where lamplight spilled from his windows, well past the hour when most of Millbrook had retired for the night. At 53, he was a man who'd seen enough human suffering to understand that healing often required more than medicine. It demanded courage, compassion, and sometimes a willingness to stand against the comfortable prejudices of one's neighbors. Thomas approached the doctor's front door with Sarah leaning heavily on his arm, her face pale with pain and exhaustion. The walk from the cabin had taken nearly 2 hours, with frequent stops to rest her injured leg. Now standing on Dr. Morrison's porch at 10:30 in the evening, Thomas felt the full weight of what he was asking. "Are you certain about this?" Sarah whispered, her breath visible in the cold night air. "As certain as I can be," Thomas replied, though his hand trembled as he reached for the brass door knocker. The sound echoed through the house, 3 measured knocks that seemed to announce the arrival of something momentous. Thomas heard footsteps approaching, then the scrape of a bolt being drawn back. The door opened to reveal Dr. Morrison in his shirt sleeves, spectacles perched on his nose, a medical journal still in his hand. Ezra Morrison was not a large man, but he possessed the kind of steady presence that made people trust him instinctively. His hair had gone silver at the temples, and his hands bore the careful scars of someone who'd spent decades handling sharp instruments in service of healing. When he saw Thomas supporting an injured young woman on his doorstep, his expression shifted immediately from curiosity to professional concern. "Thomas Bradley," Dr. Morrison said, setting aside his journal. "What's happened here?" "Dr. Morrison, sir. This is Miss Sarah. She's hurt her leg badly, and I hoped. That is, I wondered if you might ... double quotes. Of course. Bring her inside immediately." Dr. Morrison stepped back to allow them entry, his eyes already assessing Sarah's condition with the practiced gaze of someone who'd learned to read pain in a patient's posture. "Can you walk to the examination room, or shall I fetch a chair?" "I can manage," Sarah said softly, though Thomas felt her grip tighten on his arm as they followed Dr. Morrison down a hallway lined with medical texts and anatomical drawings. The examination room smelled of carbolic acid and dried herbs, with shelves of bottles containing mysterious liquids and powders. A oil lamp cast steady light across a leather-topped table where Dr. Morrison conducted his work. Thomas helped Sarah onto the table, then stepped back as the doctor began his examination. "When did this injury occur?" Dr. Morrison asked, his hands gentle but thorough as he examined Sarah's swollen leg. 3 days ago," Sarah replied. "I caught my foot in a hole while running and heard something snap." "Running from what?" The question was asked casually, but Thomas heard the undercurrent of concern in Dr. Morrison's voice. Sarah glanced at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. They'd agreed during the walk that if they were going to trust Dr. Morrison with their secret, they needed to trust him completely. "I was running from bounty hunters," Sarah said quietly. "Men who wanted to return me to Carlisle Indian Industrial School." Dr. Morrison's hands paused for a moment in their examination, but his expression remained professionally neutral. "I see. And your name, miss?" "Sarah Blackfeather. Winona is my real name, but I've been called Sarah for 6 years." The doctor nodded as if patients regularly arrived at his door carrying false identities and fleeing pursuers. "Well, Miss Blackfeather, you've sustained a significant fracture of the fibula. That's the smaller bone in your lower leg. It's not life-threatening, but it requires proper treatment if you want to walk normally again." Thomas felt relief wash over him. A broken bone was serious, but it was something Dr. Morrison could fix. "Can you help her, sir?" "I can set the bone and provide a proper splint," Dr. Morrison replied. "But the patient will need several weeks of rest and limited mobility for proper healing." He looked directly at Sarah. "I assume rest is not an option for you at present?" "No. Sir, I need to be able to travel tomorrow night if possible." Dr. Morrison removed his spectacles and cleaned them thoughtfully. "Miss Blackfeather, in my experience, young women don't flee from bounty hunters unless they're involved in something considerably more complex than truancy from school. Would you be willing to share the full circumstances of your situation?" Thomas watched Sarah struggle with the decision. Everything about Dr. Morrison suggested a man worthy of trust. His calm demeanor, his willingness to treat her without questions about payment, his apparent lack of prejudice about her Indian heritage. But trusting the wrong person could doom not only Sarah but the 30 warriors who were even now approaching Millbrook. "Doctor," Sarah said finally, "what I'm about to tell you could put you in danger. Are you prepared for that possibility?" "Doctor." Morrison replaced his spectacles and regarded her with steady eyes. "Miss Blackfeather, I took an oath to do no harm and to help those in need of healing. Sometimes that oath requires accepting certain risks." Over the next 20 minutes, as Dr. Morrison worked to set Sarah's leg and fashion a proper splint, she told him everything: her father's death, the evidence of government corruption, the approaching warriors, and the crucial meeting that needed to take place at the stone bridge. To his credit, Dr. Morrison listened without interruption, his hands steady as he wrapped Sarah's leg in carefully positioned splints and clean bandages. When she finished her account, he was quiet for several minutes, considering the implications of what he'd heard. "So," he said finally, "you're asking me to help facilitate a meeting between Lakota warriors and a young woman, carrying evidence that could expose federal corruption in Indian affairs. And this meeting must take place tomorrow night at a location that will require you to travel several miles on a freshly set broken leg." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied. "I know how it sounds." "It sounds," Dr. Morrison said, washing his hands in a basin of clean water, "like something that could prevent a great deal of unnecessary bloodshed and injustice." He dried his hands on a clean towel and turned to face them both. "What do you need from me?" Thomas felt his heart leap with hope and gratitude. "We need transportation to the bridge tomorrow night, sir. Sarah can't walk that distance, and if the warriors don't find her, they'll come into town looking for her," Dr. Morrison finished, "which would likely result in panic and violence." "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "My cousin Joseph is a good man, but he's also a warrior who's sworn to protect me. If he thinks I've been harmed or captured, he won't hesitate to take action." Dr. Morrison moved to a cabinet filled with medical supplies and began selecting items: additional bandages, a bottle of laudanum for pain, antiseptic solution. "I'll need to examine your leg again tomorrow evening before we attempt any travel. But assuming the swelling hasn't worsened, I can transport you to the bridge in my medical wagon." "Dr. Morrison," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion, "why are you willing to help us? You could get in serious trouble if anyone finds out." The doctor paused in his preparations and looked at Thomas with something that might have been pride. "Thomas, in the 5 years I've known you, you've never asked me for anything unreasonable or selfish. You've never lied to me or tried to manipulate me for personal gain. If you believe this young woman deserves help, that's recommendation enough for me." He turned to Sarah. "As for your situation, Miss Blackfeather, I've seen enough government corruption in my lifetime to know that exposing it is usually the right thing to do, regardless of the personal cost." Sarah blinked back tears. "Thank you, Dr. Morrison. You don't know what this means." "I think I do," the doctor replied gently. "Now let's discuss the practical arrangements. You'll both need to stay here tonight. It's too dangerous for you to return to that cabin, and Thomas can't go back to the workhouse without arousing suspicion about his whereabouts." Thomas felt a spike of anxiety. "Mrs. Whitmore will notice I'm missing." "Leave Mrs. Whitmore to me," Dr. Morrison said with a slight smile. "I'll pay her a visit first thing in the morning and explain that I needed your assistance with a medical emergency that required an overnight stay. She may not like it, but she won't dare contradict the town doctor." As Dr. Morrison prepared sleeping arrangements, Thomas on a cot in the examination room, Sarah in the small guest bedroom typically reserved for patients requiring overnight observation, Thomas marveled at how quickly their desperate situation had transformed into something manageable. "Dr. Morrison," Sarah said as the doctor helped her to the guest room, "there's something else you should know. The evidence my father gathered, it's not just about our reservation. He believed the corruption extends to multiple agencies, multiple tribes, possibly all the way to Washington." Dr. Morrison paused in the hallway. "How extensive are we talking about?" Land fraud, embezzlement of tribal funds, illegal mining contracts, falsified reports to Congress, Sarah listed. My father estimated that millions of dollars have been stolen, and thousands of acres of protected tribal land have been sold illegally. And this evidence is hidden on your reservation? In a place only I know how to find, Sarah confirmed. But first, I need to reach my cousin and his warriors safely. They're my protection for the journey back to Dakota Territory and then to Washington. Dr. Morrison was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. Miss Blackfeather, if what you're describing is accurate, then helping you isn't just an act of medical charity, it's a patriotic duty. Our government may have many flaws, but it was founded on principles of justice and law. Corruption that steals from the vulnerable and lies to the people makes a mockery of those principles. Later that night, as Thomas lay on the examination room cot listening to the house settle around him, he reflected on the extraordinary turn his life had taken. 3 days ago, he'd been just another workhouse orphan, invisible and unremarkable. Now he was harboring a Lakota princess, planning a secret rendezvous with Indian warriors, and working to expose government corruption that reached all the way to the nation's capital. The magnitude of it should have terrified him. Instead, Thomas felt more alive than he had since his parents died. For the first time in 5 years, he was part of something important, something that mattered beyond the gray routine of institutional survival. From the guest room, he could hear Dr. Morrison checking on Sarah's condition, his voice low and reassuring as he discussed pain management and mobility restrictions. The doctor had accepted their extraordinary story without skepticism, committed himself to helping despite obvious risks, and done it all with the calm professionalism that made him respected throughout Millbrook. But Thomas also understood that tomorrow night would test all of them in ways they couldn't fully anticipate. 30 Lakota warriors converging on a small Pennsylvania town was unprecedented in the region's history. Even with the best intentions on all sides, the potential for misunderstanding and violence was enormous. As sleep finally claimed him, Thomas's last conscious thought was a prayer not to the distant God of Mrs. Whitmore's cold sermons, but to whatever force in the universe guided lost children toward the help they needed. He prayed that tomorrow night would bring reunion rather than bloodshed, justice rather than tragedy, and hope rather than despair. What Thomas couldn't know was that 20 miles away, Joseph Running Wolf and his advance scouts had already spotted the lights of Millbrook in the distance. The warriors had made better time than expected, traveling by night and resting in hidden camps during the day. They would reach the stone bridge by tomorrow evening, exactly as planned. But they weren't the only ones moving through the Pennsylvania darkness. Federal agents from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, alerted by the bounty hunters who'd lost Sarah 3 days earlier, were also converging on the area. They'd been tracking reports of Indian movement for the past week, and they had orders to prevent any unauthorized gathering of tribal warriors at all costs. The stage was set for confrontation. And at the center of it all was a 12-year-old orphan who'd chosen compassion over safety, a Lakota princess carrying the hopes of her people, and a small-town doctor who believed that healing sometimes required standing up to the powerful on behalf of the powerless. Tomorrow night would determine whether their faith in each other was strong enough to prevent a tragedy that could echo through history. Dawn broke gray and cold over Millbrook, with heavy clouds that promised rain before evening. Thomas woke to the sound of Dr. Morrison moving quietly through the house, preparing for what would be one of the most dangerous days in the town's history. The weight of their secret felt heavier in daylight, when the ordinary sounds of a waking community made their extraordinary plans seem almost impossible. Dr. Morrison appeared in the examination room doorway with a steaming cup of coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs. Eat quickly, Thomas. I need you to help me with something before I visit Mrs. Whitmore. Thomas sat up on the cot, his muscles stiff from sleeping on the narrow surface. What kind of help, sir? I'm going to teach you how to load and fire my Hunting rifle, Dr. Morrison said matter-of-factly. If tonight goes badly, you may need to protect Miss Blackfeather while I handle other matters. The casual way the doctor discussed arming a 12-year-old orphan with a deadly weapon spoke volumes about the seriousness of their situation. Thomas nodded, though his stomach churned with anxiety that had nothing to do with hunger. After breakfast, Dr. Morrison led Thomas to a small workshop behind the house where he kept his hunting equipment. The rifle was a Winchester repeater, well-maintained and deadly accurate in the right hands. For the next hour, the doctor patiently explained the mechanics of loading, aiming, and firing using an unloaded weapon and emphasizing safety procedures. Remember, Dr. Morrison said as Thomas practiced shouldering the rifle, this is only for absolute emergencies. If shooting becomes necessary, aim for the largest part of your target and squeeze the trigger slowly. Don't try to be fancy, just effective. Thomas nodded solemnly, hoping he'd never need to use the knowledge Dr. Morrison was giving him. But as he practiced the loading sequence under the doctor's watchful eye, he felt a grim satisfaction in knowing he could protect Sarah if circumstances demanded it. Now, Dr. Morrison said, taking back the rifle, I'm going to visit Mrs. Whitmore and explain your absence. While I'm gone, stay with Miss Blackfeather and keep watch. If anyone comes to the house asking questions, don't answer the door. Dr. Morrison departed for the workhouse, leaving Thomas alone with Sarah, who was sitting in the kitchen with her injured leg elevated on a second chair. She'd borrowed one of the doctor's white shirts, which made her look younger and more vulnerable than the mysterious woman he'd first encountered by the creek. "How are you feeling?" Thomas asked, settling into a chair across from her. "Physically?" "Much better. Dr. Morrison's treatment has already reduced the swelling considerably." Sarah paused, staring out the kitchen window at the gathering clouds. "Emotionally terrified. About tonight?" "About everything," Sarah admitted. "Thomas, what if I'm wrong about the evidence my father gathered? What if I'm leading Joseph and his warriors into danger for nothing? What if I've misunderstood what my father wanted me to do?" Thomas considered her words carefully. In the 3 days since he'd met Sarah, he'd watched her display remarkable courage and determination. But now, facing the moment when her actions would affect not just herself but 30 warriors and potentially the entire town of Millbrook, she was experiencing the doubt that came with enormous responsibility. "What did your father tell you exactly?" Thomas asked. Sarah closed her eyes, as if visualizing the conversation. "He said the evidence was hidden in the old medicine lodge, beneath the stone where his grandfather used to pray. He said it contained proof that the Indian agent had been stealing food meant for our people and selling reservation land to mining companies without tribal consent. And he believed this evidence could help your people?" "He said it could save them," Sarah replied. "The reservation is dying, Thomas. The government keeps reducing our food rations, claiming budget constraints, but the money is being stolen. Our children are starving while corrupt officials get rich." Thomas felt anger kindle in his chest, not just at the faceless bureaucrats who would steal food from hungry children, but at a system that allowed such cruelty to flourish in darkness. "Then you have to try, don't you? Even if it's dangerous, even if you're not sure it will work." Sarah opened her eyes and looked at him with something that might have been amazement. "How did you become so wise at 12 years old?" "I learned that doing nothing when you could help is worse than trying and failing," Thomas replied. "If I hadn't helped you cross the creek 3 days ago, you might have died alone in the woods. If Dr. Morrison hadn't agreed to help us, you'd be facing tonight without allies. Sometimes the right thing to do is obvious, you just have to be brave enough to do it." Before Sarah could respond, they heard the sound of Dr. Morrison's buggy returning from the workhouse. Thomas looked out the window and felt his stomach drop. Mrs. Whitmore sat beside the doctor on the buggy seat, her steel-gray hair pinned back severely and her mouth set in a line that promised unpleasant consequences for someone She's with him, Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah struggled to her feet, wincing as she put weight on her injured leg. What does that mean? It means Mrs. Whitmore didn't believe his story about the medical emergency, Thomas replied. She's here to collect me herself. Dr. Morrison entered the house with Mrs. Whitmore close behind, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the kitchen, the 2 coffee cups on the table, Sarah's improvised crutch leaning against the wall, the general atmosphere of conspiracy that seemed to cling to guilty secrets. Thomas Bradley, Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. You will gather your things immediately and return to the workhouse where you belong. Mrs. Whitmore, Dr. Morrison interjected smoothly, as I explained. Thomas has been assisting me with a complex medical case that required overnight observation. His help has been invaluable. The matron's pale eyes fixed on Sarah, who stood as straight as her injured leg would allow. And this would be your patient, doctor? She looks remarkably healthy for someone requiring emergency medical attention. Thomas felt the situation slipping out of control. Mrs. Whitmore possessed an uncanny ability to detect deception, honed by years of managing children who'd learned that survival sometimes required creative interpretations of truth. I am a patient, Sarah said calmly. I sustained a broken leg several days ago, and Dr. Morrison has been treating the injury. I see. And where exactly are you from, miss? I don't recognize you from town. Thomas watched Sarah weigh her options. The truth was impossible, but a lie might be worse if Mrs. Whitmore chose to investigate. I'm traveling through the area, Sarah replied. I was injured while crossing the creek, and Dr. Morrison kindly provided treatment. Mrs. Whitmore's smile was sharp as broken glass. How fortunate that our local doctor was available. And how convenient that young Thomas happened to discover you just when medical assistance was needed. The matron moved closer to Sarah, studying her with the intensity of someone accustomed to extracting confessions from uncomfortable children. Your clothing is unusual for a traveler. Expensive fabric, well-tailored, but muddy and torn. Your hands are soft, suggesting you're not accustomed to manual labor. Your speech patterns indicate education, but there's something else, an accent you're trying to hide. Thomas felt sweat beading on his forehead. Mrs. Whitmore's observational skills were legendary among the workhouse children, who'd learned that she could read guilt in a person's posture and lies in the set of their shoulders. Mrs. Whitmore, Dr. Morrison said firmly, I must ask you to respect my patient's privacy. Medical confidentiality is not a suggestion, it's a professional obligation. Of course, doctor. But surely you understand my concern about Thomas's involvement in matters that don't concern him. The boy has responsibilities at the workhouse, and I cannot allow him to neglect those responsibilities for. She paused, her eyes glittering with suspicion, whatever the situation actually involves. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Thomas could see Sarah struggling not to reveal the pain her leg was causing her. Dr. Morrison calculating how to diffuse the situation without arousing further suspicion, and Mrs. Whitmore preparing to press her advantage. Then, from somewhere in the distance, came the sound that changed everything, the rapid clatter of hoofbeats approaching at high speed. Through the kitchen window, Thomas could see a rider in a dark coat pushing his horse hard toward Dr. Morrison's house. The rider dismounted before his horse had fully stopped and pounded on the front door with urgent fists. Dr. Morrison hurried to answer, returning moments later with a telegram clutched in his hand and his face pale with worry. What is it? Mrs. Whitmore demanded. Dr. Morrison read the telegram again, as if hoping the words might change. It's from Sheriff Patterson in the county seat. Federal agents arrived there this morning asking about reports of Indian movement in our area. They're requesting cooperation from local law enforcement and civilian authorities. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. Federal agents meant Bureau of Indian Affairs investigators, possibly the same men who'd been pursuing Sarah since she left the reservation. If they reached Millbrook before tonight's meeting, double quotes, Indian movement? Mrs. Whitmore's voice rose sharply. What kind of Indian movement? The telegram doesn't specify, Dr. Morrison replied, though Thomas could see in his eyes that the doctor understood exactly what kind of movement they were discussing. But the agents are requesting a meeting with local authorities this afternoon to discuss appropriate security measures. Sarah sank back into her chair, her face ashen. The federal agents had found their trail faster than expected, which meant Joseph running. Wolf and his warriors might be walking into a trap when they reached the stone bridge. Mrs. Whitmore looked around the room with renewed suspicion, her instincts telling her that the arrival of this telegram was somehow connected to the strange situation she discovered at Dr. Morrison's house. "Doctor," she said slowly, "I think it would be best if Thomas and I return to the workhouse immediately. These are matters for adults to handle, not children." "Actually," Dr. Morrison said, his voice carefully controlled, "I think it would be best if everyone remained here for the time being. If there's potential danger in the area, the safest place for Thomas and my patient is under medical supervision." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by another sound from outside, the measured tread of multiple horses moving at a walk rather than a gallop. Thomas looked out the window and saw 5 men in dark suits and badges riding slowly down Elm Street, their eyes scanning every house and building with the methodical attention of hunters tracking prey. "Federal agents," Dr. Morrison said quietly. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to the medallion hidden beneath her borrowed shirt. If the agents searched the house and found her, everything would be lost, not just her mission, but the lives of 30 warriors who were even now approaching a meeting that had become a trap. "Thomas," Sarah whispered urgently, "there's something I need you to do. If they take me, you have to get word to Joseph somehow. Tell him the meeting place is compromised, and he should return to Dakota Territory without me." "I won't let them take you," Thomas replied, though he had no idea how a 12-year-old Orphan could protect anyone from federal agents. Mrs. Whitmore was watching this exchange with growing alarm, her suspicions crystallizing into certainty that she'd stumbled into something far more serious than a simple medical case. The agents were dismounting outside Dr. Morrison's house now, their spurs ringing against the wooden porch as they approached the front door. In moments, they would be inside, asking questions that would be impossible to answer without revealing everything. Dr. Morrison straightened his shoulders and moved toward the door. "Whatever happens," he said quietly to Thomas and Sarah, "remember that the truth is more powerful than fear. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is trust that doing right will find a way to triumph over doing wrong." The knock on the door was firm and official, the sound of authority that expected immediate compliance. As Dr. Morrison went to answer it, Thomas reached out and took Sarah's hand, offering what comfort he could to the young woman whose courage had inspired his own. Outside, storm clouds gathered like an omen, and somewhere in the Pennsylvania wilderness, 30 Lakota warriors moved steadily toward a rendezvous that would test everything Thomas had learned about bravery, loyalty, and the price of standing up for what was right. The final act was about to begin, and none of them knew whether it would end in triumph or tragedy. Agent Harrison Caldwell stood 6 feet tall in his black wool coat, with the kind of pale gray eyes that seemed to see through whatever story you thought you were telling. Behind him, 4 other federal agents spread through Dr. Morrison's front parlor like smoke, their presence transforming the comfortable room into an interrogation chamber. "Dr. Morrison," Agent Caldwell said, removing his hat to reveal thinning brown hair, "I'm with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and we're investigating reports of unauthorized Indian movement in this region. We understand you serve as the local medical authority." "I do," Dr. Morrison replied, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "How can I assist you, Agent Caldwell?" Thomas remained in the kitchen with Sarah and Mrs. Whitmore, straining to hear every word of the conversation in the next room. Sarah sat rigidly upright, her hand clutched around the hidden medallion, while Mrs. Whitmore watched both of them with the sharp attention of someone who knew she was witnessing something significant. "We have reliable intelligence," Agent Caldwell continued, "that a group of Lakota warriors left their reservation in Dakota Territory approximately 2 weeks ago. They're believed to be heading toward Pennsylvania, possibly to the specific area." Dr. Morrison's pause was barely perceptible. "That seems unlikely, Agent Caldwell. What would bring Indian warriors to Millbrook?" "We believe they're pursuing a runaway from Carlisle Indian Industrial School, a young woman named Sarah Blackfeather, daughter of the late Chief Standing Bear. She's wanted for questioning regarding theft of government property and incitement of tribal unrest." Thomas felt Sarah stiffen beside him. The federal agents weren't just hunting her randomly. They had specific information about her identity, her father, and her mission. Someone had betrayed her, or the government surveillance network was more extensive than anyone had imagined. "I see," Dr. Morrison said carefully. "And you believe this person might be in our area?" "We're checking every town within a 50-mile radius of her last known location," Agent Caldwell replied. "Dr. Morrison, have you treated any injuries recently?" "That might be consistent with someone who'd been traveling rough for several days. Perhaps a young woman claiming to be from out of town?" The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat in the sudden silence, and he knew that Dr. Morrison was faced with a choice that would determine all their fates. "Agent Caldwell," Dr. Morrison said slowly, "I treat many patients, and medical confidentiality prevents me from discussing their cases without proper legal authorization. Doctor, this is a matter of federal security. The Lakota warriors pursuing this woman are heavily armed and may pose a threat to local civilians. Any information you can provide could help us resolve this situation peacefully." From the kitchen, Thomas could hear the subtle menace in Agent Caldwell's voice, the kind of threat that came wrapped in reasonable words but carried the full weight of federal authority. Mrs. Whitmore was listening to every word with growing alarm. She looked at Sarah with new understanding, her pale eyes widening as the pieces fell into place. The expensive but torn clothing, the hidden accent, the mysterious circumstances of her appearance. Suddenly, it all made sense. "You're her," Mrs. Whitmore whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're the Indian girl they're looking for." Sarah met the matron's gaze steadily. "My name is Winona Blackfeather, and yes, I am who they seek. Dear God," Mrs. Whitmore breathed. "Thomas, do you understand what you've gotten involved in? These are federal agents. This is about Indian wars and government business. Children have no place in such matters. Sometimes children are the only ones brave enough to do what's right." Thomas replied, though his voice shook with the enormity of what they were facing. In the parlor, Agent Caldwell was pressing his advantage. "Dr. Morrison, I should mention that harboring a federal fugitive is a serious crime, punishable by substantial fines and imprisonment. I'm sure a respected member of the community like yourself wouldn't want to jeopardize your practice and reputation over a misguided sense of charity." Thomas heard Dr. Morrison's footsteps moving toward the kitchen, and moments later the doctor appeared in the doorway. His face was calm, but Thomas could see tension in the set of his shoulders. "Agent Caldwell would like to speak with everyone present in the house," Dr. Morrison said quietly. "Mrs. Whitmore, Thomas, Miss Collins, if you would join us in the parlor." Thomas helped Sarah to her feet, noting how she favored her injured leg despite Dr. Morrison's treatment. As they moved toward the parlor, Sarah whispered urgently in his ear, "Remember what I told you about warning Joseph. If they arrest me, you have to find a way to reach the bridge." The parlor felt smaller with 6 federal agents. Mrs. Whitmore, Dr. Morrison, Thomas, and Sarah crowded into it. "Agent Caldwell," studied each face with the practiced attention of someone accustomed to reading guilt and deception. "Now then," Agent Caldwell said, settling into Dr. Morrison's favorite armchair as if he owned it. "Let's start with introductions. You are?" He looked directly at Mrs. Whitmore. "Agnes Whitmore, matron of the Millbrook Workhouse," she replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "And you, young man?" "Thomas Bradley, sir," Thomas managed. Though his mouth felt dry as dust, Agent Caldwell's attention shifted to Sarah, and Thomas saw her square her shoulders as if preparing for battle. "And you, miss?" "Sarah Collins," she said calmly. "I'm traveling through the area and was injured crossing the creek. Dr. Morrison has been treating my leg." "I see. And where exactly are you traveling from, Miss Collins?" "Philadelphia," Sarah replied without hesitation. "I was visiting family there and am returning home to Pittsburgh." Agent Caldwell smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "That's interesting, Miss Collins, because my agents have been checking all the major routes between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and we have no record of anyone matching your description passing through any of the usual stops." Thomas felt the trap closing around them. The federal agents had been thorough in their investigation, covering all the obvious escape routes and checking stories before they heard them. "Perhaps," Agent Caldwell continued, "you could provide more specific details about your family in Philadelphia. Names, addresses, the nature of your visit." Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "My Aunt Margaret Collins lives on Spruce Street. I was visiting her after my father's funeral." "And your father's name?" "Robert Collins. He worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad." Agent Caldwell nodded as if accepting her story, but Thomas could see the man was simply gathering information to check later. "Dr. Morrison, what can you tell me about Miss Collins' injury?" "Fractured fibula, consistent with a fall or misstep," Dr. Morrison replied. "I've provided a splint and pain management. The injury is approximately 3 days old." 3 days, Agent Caldwell repeated thoughtfully. That would place the injury at approximately the same time Sarah Blackfeather disappeared from her last known location. He stood and moved closer to Sarah. "Miss Collins, would you mind if I examined your hands?" "My hands?" Sarah asked, though. She extended them without obvious reluctance. Agent Caldwell studied her palms and fingers with practiced attention. "Interesting. Your hands show calluses consistent with manual labor, but also some newer blisters that suggest recent rough travel. Additionally, there are faint marks around your wrists that might indicate recent rope burns." Thomas's heart sank. The federal agents were clearly experienced in tracking fugitives, and they'd noticed details that would never have occurred to him. "Agent Caldwell," Dr. Morrison interjected, "I'm not sure what you're implying, but I'm implying nothing." "Doctor, I'm stating facts. This young woman has injuries consistent with someone who's been traveling rough for several days, possibly while restrained. Her story about family in Philadelphia can be easily verified, and if it proves false..." He let the threat hang unfinished. Mrs. Whitmore had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation. Finally, she stood abruptly, her tall frame commanding attention. "Agent Caldwell," she said in her crisp, authoritative voice, "I may be able to provide some clarity to the situation." Thomas felt his stomach drop. Mrs. Whitmore had figured out Sarah's true identity, and now she was preparing to reveal it to the federal agents. Everything they'd worked for, everything Sarah had sacrificed, was about to be destroyed by the workhouse matron's sense of duty to authority. "Please proceed, Mrs. Whitmore," Agent Caldwell said, clearly sensing that he was about to receive the information he needed. Mrs. Whitmore looked around the room, her gaze lingering on Thomas's desperate face, then on Sarah's defiant expression, and finally on Dr. Morrison's calm resignation. When she spoke, her words surprised everyone. "Agent Caldwell, this young woman arrived at the workhouse 3 days ago seeking temporary shelter. She told me she was traveling from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh and had been injured crossing the creek. given her obvious distress and injury. I arranged for Dr. Morrison to provide medical treatment. Thomas stared at Mrs. Whitmore in shock. The matron was lying to federal agents, providing Sarah with an alibi that would be difficult to disprove. But why would Mrs. Whitmore risk her position and reputation to protect someone she'd just met? Agent Caldwell frowned. Mrs. Whitmore, you didn't mention this when I asked for introductions. You asked who I was, not for a detailed account of recent events. Mrs. Whitmore replied with the kind of bureaucratic precision that came from years of dealing with government officials. However, if you're investigating reports of Indian activity, I can assure you that Miss Collins is not the person you're seeking. And how can you be so certain? Mrs. Whitmore's smile was sharp. Agent Caldwell, I've been managing children and young adults for over 20 years. I've learned to recognize deception, desperation, and danger. Miss Collins is injured and frightened, but she's not a dangerous fugitive. The federal agent studied Mrs. Whitmore's face, clearly trying to determine if she was lying. Thomas held his breath, knowing that their entire plan depended on Agent Caldwell accepting the matron's testimony. Furthermore, Mrs. Whitmore continued, I must question the wisdom of pursuing Indian warriors into a civilian area. Millbrook has families, children, elderly residents who would be terrified by the presence of armed federal agents conducting military operations. Mrs. Whitmore, these warriors pose a significant threat. Do they? Mrs. Whitmore interrupted. Have they attacked anyone? Have they threatened civilian populations? Or are they simply trying to retrieve a member of their community who may have been unjustly accused? Thomas was amazed by Mrs. Whitmore's transformation. The cold, rigid matron who'd made his life miserable for 5 years was suddenly defending Sarah with the kind of principled courage he'd never imagined her possessing. Agent Caldwell was clearly frustrated by this unexpected resistance. Mrs. Whitmore, I appreciate your concern for local safety, but you don't understand the broader implications of this situation. Sarah Blackfeather is wanted in connection with serious crimes against the federal government. What crimes specifically? Dr. Morrison asked quietly. Theft of government documents, incitement of tribal rebellion, and conspiracy to interfere with federal Indian policy. Agent Caldwell replied. Sarah spoke for the first time since providing her false identity. What if those government documents proved that federal officials were stealing from Indian reservations? What if the so-called rebellion was actually an attempt to expose corruption? Would that change your perspective on who the real criminals are? The words hung in the air like a challenge. Agent Caldwell's eyes narrowed as he studied Sarah's face, clearly recognizing something in her tone and bearing that confirmed his suspicions. Miss Collins, he said slowly, that's a very interesting question for someone who claims to be traveling from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. Thomas realized that Sarah had made a crucial mistake. Her passion for justice had overcome her caution, and she'd revealed too much about her knowledge of the situation. Agent Caldwell was now certain he'd found his quarry. Outside, the storm clouds that had been gathering all day finally opened, and rain began to fall against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled like the sound of approaching war. The time for deception had passed. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Thomas could only hope that somewhere in the Pennsylvania wilderness, Joseph running. Wolf and his warriors were prepared for what was coming. Agent Caldwell's smile was the cold expression of a predator who'd finally cornered his prey. Miss Sarah Blackfeather, he said, dropping all pretense. You've just made this conversation much more interesting. The parlor fell silent except for the drumming of rain against the windows. Thomas felt Sarah tense beside him, her hand moving instinctively toward the hidden medallion. Mrs. Whitmore's face had gone pale, but her jaw remained set with determination. I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, Sarah said, though her voice carried less conviction than before. Of course you do, Agent Caldwell replied, rising from his chair with deliberate slowness. You see, Miss Blackfeather, we've been tracking you for much longer than you realize. The Bureau has had informants on your reservation for months, watching your father's activities, monitoring his contacts with other tribal leaders. Dr. Morrison stepped protectively closer to Sarah. Agent Caldwell, even if this young woman is who you believe her to be, she's injured and under medical care. Whatever questions you have can wait until— I'm afraid they can't, Doctor, Agent Caldwell interrupted. Miss Blackfeather is wanted in connection with the theft of classified government documents. Documents that, if they fell into the wrong hands, could compromise ongoing federal operations throughout the Dakota Territory. Thomas watched Sarah's face carefully and saw something flicker in her eyes, not fear, but surprise. Whatever documents the government claimed she'd stolen, they weren't what she'd expected them to accuse her of taking. What documents? Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the circumstances. Caldwell reached into his coat and withdrew a folded sheet of official letterhead. According to our records, you removed sensitive correspondence between the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the War Department regarding strategic resource allocation on your reservation. Sarah shook her head slowly. I've never seen any correspondence between the Bureau and the War Department. I don't even know what strategic resource allocation means. Perhaps not, Agent Caldwell conceded. But your father certainly did. Chief Standing Bear was under investigation for inciting tribal resistance to federal authority. The documents he gathered weren't evidence of corruption. They were classified materials he had no right to possess. Thomas felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. If Agent Caldwell was telling the truth, then Sarah's entire mission was based on a misunderstanding. Her father hadn't gathered evidence of corruption, he'd stolen government secrets, and now she was continuing his crime. But something in Sarah's expression told Thomas that Agent Caldwell's version of events didn't align with what she knew to be true. My father was a peaceful man, Sarah said firmly. He spent his final years trying to negotiate better conditions for our people through legal channels. He believed in working within the system, not against it. Did he tell you that while he was training you to continue his espionage activities? Agent Caldwell asked. Miss Blackfeather, your father was no simple reservation chief. He was the leader of a pan-tribal conspiracy designed to undermine federal Indian policy across multiple territories. Mrs. Whitmore had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm. Agent Caldwell, she interjected, even if everything you're saying is true, this young woman is clearly not a dangerous criminal. She's injured, alone, and seeking help. Surely the federal government has more pressing concerns than pursuing one frightened girl. Mrs. Whitmore, this frightened girl is being pursued by 30 heavily armed Lakota warriors who believe she's carrying information that could justify acts of war against the United States government. Agent Caldwell replied, Do you understand the implications if those warriors reach Millbrook? The agent moved to the window, pulling back the curtain to peer into the rain-soaked street. Even now, my men are positioning themselves around the town perimeter. If the Indian War Party attempts to enter Millbrook, we'll be forced to engage them with deadly force. Thomas felt ice form in his stomach. The federal agents weren't just hunting Sarah. They were preparing for armed conflict with Joseph Running Wolf and his warriors. The meeting at the stone bridge had become a trap that could end in massacre. Agent Caldwell, Dr. Morrison said. Carefully, surely there's a way to resolve this situation without violence. If Miss Blackfeather surrenders voluntarily, perhaps the warriors would retreat peacefully. That might be possible, Agent Caldwell agreed. If Miss Blackfeather were willing to cooperate fully with our investigation. If she provides us with the location of the stolen documents and agrees to testify against the other conspirators in her father's network. Sarah's laugh was bitter. You want me to betray my own people to save myself? I want you to help us prevent a war that could cost hundreds of lives, Agent Caldwell replied. Miss Blackfeather, you're an educated woman. You understand the reality of your situation. 30 warriors against federal troops and local militia. How do you think that battle would end? The agent was right, and everyone in the room knew it. No matter how skilled and brave Joseph Running Wolf's warriors might be, they couldn't stand against the kind of force the federal government could bring to bear. If the meeting at the bridge turned into armed conflict, the Lakota would be slaughtered. What exactly are you proposing? Sarah asked quietly. Agent Caldwell returned to his chair, sensing victory. You surrender the stolen documents and provide detailed information about your father's network of conspirators. In exchange, we'll arrange safe passage for the warriors back to Dakota Territory, and you'll face reduced charges for your cooperation. And if I refuse, then we'll be forced to assume you're an active threat to federal security. The warriors pursuing you will be treated as a hostile war party, and this situation will be resolved through military action. Thomas looked around the room, seeing the weight of impossible choices settling on everyone present. Mrs. Whitmore was gripping the back of her chair, so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Dr. Morrison's face showed the strain of a man watching. His principles collide with harsh reality, but Sarah's expression had changed. The fear and uncertainty that had marked her features since Agent Caldwell's arrival were being replaced by something harder, more determined. Agent Caldwell, she said, rising to her feet despite the pain in her injured leg. There's something you need to understand about the documents you claim my father stole. I'm listening. Sarah reached beneath her borrowed shirt and withdrew the medallion, letting it catch the lamplight as it hung from its leather cord. This medallion has been in my family for 4 generations. It marks the bearer as a speaker for the people, someone authorized to carry their voice to the world beyond our boundaries. Agent Caldwell's eyes fixed on the medallion with obvious recognition. Miss Blackfeather, possession of tribal regalia doesn't change the fact that my father didn't steal government documents. Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying new authority. He gathered evidence of crimes committed against my people. Evidence of food supplies sold for personal profit while children starved. Evidence of protected reservation land sold illegally to mining companies. Evidence of federal officials living in luxury while the people they were supposed to protect died of neglect. She took a step toward Agent Caldwell, no longer the frightened fugitive, but a woman claiming her rightful role as defender of her people. The reason you want that evidence destroyed isn't because it threatens federal security, Sarah continued. It's because it threatens federal criminals. My father spent the last year of his life documenting a network of corruption that reaches all the way to Washington. And you're terrified of what will happen when that truth becomes public. Agent Caldwell's composure cracked slightly. Miss Blackfeather, you're making very serious accusations without any proof to support them. The proof is hidden where you'll never find it, Sarah replied. And as long as I remain free, there's always the possibility that truth will see daylight. The federal agent stood slowly, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his sidearm. Miss Blackfeather, I'm placing you under arrest for theft of government property, conspiracy against federal authority, and incitement of tribal rebellion. Wait, the voice came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Whitmore had stepped between Agent Caldwell and Sarah, her tall frame blocking the agent's path. Mrs. Whitmore, Agent Caldwell said with dangerous quiet, step aside immediately. I don't think I will, the matron replied, her voice carrying the same iron authority she'd used to discipline generations of workhouse children. Agent Caldwell, I've spent my entire adult life in service to institutions, first as a teacher, then as a matron. I've always believed that following orders and respecting authority were the highest virtues. She paused, looking at Sarah with something that might have been admiration. But I've just listened to a young woman describe crimes that would make any decent person weep with rage. And I've watched federal agents prepare to murder 30 men whose only crime is trying to protect a member of their family. Agent Caldwell's face had gone dark with anger. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're interfering with a federal investigation. That's a felony offense." "Then I suppose I'm a felon," Mrs. Whitmore replied calmly. "But I'd rather be a felon than a coward." Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that the adults around him were choosing to stand for something larger than their own safety. Dr. Morrison moved to stand beside Mrs. Whitmore, his medical bag in his hand as if he were preparing to treat whatever wounds this confrontation might produce. "Agent Caldwell," Dr. Morrison said quietly, "I took an oath to do no harm. That oath extends beyond medical practice to moral practice. I cannot stand by and watch you arrest an injured young woman for the crime of trying to expose corruption." Thomas looked at the three adults who'd chosen to protect Sarah despite the enormous risks to themselves, and he felt something he'd never experienced before, the certainty that he was witnessing true courage. These weren't heroes from Rebecca's fairy tales. They were ordinary people choosing to do extraordinary things because it was right. Agent Caldwell drew his weapon, not pointing it at anyone but making its presence unmistakable. "Dr. Morrison, Mrs. Whitmore, you have 10 seconds to step away from the fugitive, or I'll be forced to place you both under arrest as well." Thunder crashed outside, and the rain intensified to a torrent that hammered against the house like bullets. Through the noise, Thomas heard something else, a sound that made his blood freeze in his veins. War cries. Distant but unmistakable, carried on the storm wind like voices from another world. Agent Caldwell heard them too, his head snapping toward the window. "The warriors," he breathed. "They're here." Through the rain-streaked glass, Thomas could see movement in the tree line beyond the town's edge, shadows that moved with purpose, heading toward the stone bridge where Sarah was supposed to meet her cousin. But Sarah was here, trapped in Dr. Morrison's parlor with federal agents who were prepared to kill to prevent her escape. The meeting that was supposed to save her people had become the trigger for exactly the kind of violence her father had spent his life trying to avoid. "Agent Caldwell," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "if you want to prevent bloodshed, there's only one way to do it." The federal agent turned to her, his weapon still drawn. "What are you proposing?" Sarah's smile was sad and beautiful and terrible. "Let me go to them. Let me tell Joseph Runningwolf that the evidence is safe and that he should take his warriors home. No one has to die today, and in exchange, I'll surrender myself to federal custody and accept whatever charges you bring against me," Sarah replied. "But only after my cousin and his men are safely away from Millbrook." Agent Caldwell considered her offer, weighing the certainty of capturing his primary target against the risk of armed conflict with 30 Lakota warriors in a civilian area. Outside, the war cries were getting closer, and Thomas knew that whatever happened next would determine not just Sarah's fate, but the future of everyone in Millbrook. The final confrontation was about to begin. The war cries that echoed through the storm-lashed streets of Millbrook carried a sound that had not been heard in Pennsylvania for over a century, the voice of warriors calling their lost family home. Agent Caldwell's hand tightened on his weapon as he calculated odds that were growing worse by the minute. "Miss Blackfeather," he said grimly, "if you're serious about preventing bloodshed, we need to move now. My men have orders to engage any hostile force that enters the town perimeter." Sarah nodded, her face pale but determined. "Thomas, help me to the bridge. Dr. Morrison, do you still have your medical wagon?" "Of course," Dr. Morrison replied, already moving toward his coat. "But Sarah, if this goes wrong, then at least we'll have tried to do what's right," Sarah finished. "Mrs. Whitmore, please stay here. You've risked enough for someone you barely know." The workhouse matron shook her head firmly. "Miss Blackfeather, I've spent 20 years teaching children that running away from difficult situations never solves anything. I won't start running now." Agent Caldwell holstered his weapon, recognizing that the situation had moved beyond simple arrest procedures. Dr. Morrison, can your wagon carry all of us to the bridge? It can, but Agent Caldwell, what guarantee do we have that your men won't fire on the warriors the moment they see them? The federal agent was quiet for a moment, listening to the war cries that seemed to be circling the town's outskirts like a storm front. Dr. Morrison, I'll be honest with you. My men are federal agents, not soldiers. They're trained for investigation and arrest, not warfare. If 30 Lakota warriors charge into Millbrook, some of my agents will panic and start shooting. Then we'd better make sure that doesn't happen, Thomas said, surprising everyone with the firmness in his young voice. Agent Caldwell looked at the 12-year-old orphan, who'd started this entire sequence of events by helping an injured woman cross a creek. Son, you don't understand the forces you're dealing with here. I understand that 30 men are about to die because they're trying to protect someone who helped their people, Thomas replied. I understand that good people are about to shoot at each other because both sides think they're doing the right thing. And I understand that sometimes the smallest action can change everything. As if summoned by Thomas's words, the war cries suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was more ominous than the sound had been, suggesting that Joseph Running, Wolf and his warriors had reached their objective and were now assessing the situation. They're at the bridge, Sarah whispered, her hand moving to the medallion around her neck. Joseph will wait there for exactly 1 hour. If I don't appear by then, he'll assume I've been captured or killed, and he'll come into town to find me. Agent Caldwell moved to the window, peering through the rain toward the edge of town where Willow Creek marked the boundary between civilization and wilderness. How many men do you have positioned around the perimeter? Dr. Morrison asked. 8 agents, plus whatever local militia Sheriff Patterson can muster on short notice, Agent Caldwell replied. Maybe 15 men total, and most of them have never been in a real fight. Against 30 Lakota warriors, Mrs. Whitmore said quietly. That would be a massacre. On both sides, Agent Caldwell agreed grimly. Dr. Morrison, get your wagon ready. We're going to try Miss Blackfeather's plan. As Dr. Morrison prepared his medical wagon, Thomas helped Sarah gather the few possessions she'd brought with her. The medallion remained visible around her neck, catching the lamplight like a beacon of hope in the growing darkness. Thomas, Sarah said quietly, there's something I need you to know. If this goes badly tonight, if Joseph and his warriors are killed, the evidence my father gathered dies with them. It's not hidden on the reservation. Joseph carries it with him, sealed in a medicine bundle that he'll destroy if he believes the mission has failed. Thomas felt the weight of this revelation settle on his shoulders. The corruption that Sarah's father had spent his life documenting would remain hidden forever if tonight ended in violence. Innocent people would continue to suffer while guilty officials grew rich from their misery. Then we won't let it go badly, Thomas said with more confidence than he felt. The wagon ride to Willow Creek was a nightmare of mud, rain, and tension. Dr. Morrison drove while Agent Caldwell sat beside him, his hand never leaving his weapon. Sarah rode in the back with Thomas and Mrs. Whitmore, her injured leg carefully braced against the wagon's jolting movement. As they approached the stone bridge, Thomas could see shapes moving in the darkness beyond warriors positioned with the tactical precision of men who'd learned warfare from birth. They'd chosen their ground well, using the natural cover of trees and rocks to create defensive positions that would make any assault costly. There, Agent Caldwell said, pointing toward the bridge itself. Do you see him? Thomas followed the agent's gaze and felt his breath catch. A single figure stood in the center of the stone bridge, motionless as a statue despite the driving rain. Even at a distance, there was something about his bearing that commanded respect, the posture of a man who'd never backed down from anything in his life. Joseph Running Wolf, Sarah whispered, and Thomas heard love and pride and desperate fear, all mixed together in her voice. Dr. Morrison brought the wagon to a stop 50 yards from the bridge, close enough for conversation, but far enough to avoid seeming threatening. Agent Caldwell climbed down first, his hands visible and empty, followed by the others. The warrior on the bridge turned at their approach, and Thomas got his first clear look at Joseph Running Wolf. He was perhaps 30 years old, tall and lean, with long black hair braided with eagle feathers. He wore traditional buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork, and a rifle rested easily in his hands. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, dark, intelligent, and completely fearless. "Winona," Joseph called in accented but clear English, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "Are you harmed?" "I'm safe, Joseph," Sarah replied, limping forward with Thomas supporting her arm. "But we have much to discuss." Joseph's gaze moved to Agent Caldwell, taking in the federal badge and the obvious tension in the man's posture. "And who speaks for the white government?" "Agent Harrison Caldwell, Bureau of Indian Affairs," the federal agent replied. "Mr. Running Wolf, I believe we can resolve this situation without violence, but that requires cooperation from both sides." Joseph's smile was cold. "The white government speaks of cooperation after sending armed men to hunt my cousin like an animal. You have an interesting definition of that word." "Joseph," Sarah said, stepping between the two men before the conversation could escalate further, "Agent Caldwell believes that father was stealing government secrets. He thinks the evidence we gathered is classified information that threatens federal security." The Lakota warrior studied Agent Caldwell with renewed interest. "Is that what they told you? That standing bear was a spy and a thief?" "That's what the evidence suggests," Agent Caldwell replied carefully. Joseph laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Agent Caldwell, my uncle Standing Bear could not read English. He spoke perhaps 50 words of your language. How exactly would he steal your government secrets?" Thomas saw Agent Caldwell's certainty waver for the first time. "The documents were translated for him by someone within the Bureau, by James Crawford," Joseph interrupted. "A Bureau clerk who grew sick of watching children starve while his supervisors stole their food money. Crawford came to Standing Bear with evidence of corruption, not the other way around." Agent Caldwell was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "Crawford disappeared 3 months ago. We assumed he'd been murdered by tribal conspirators." "He was murdered," Joseph confirmed grimly, "but not by us. He was killed by the same men who've been stealing from the reservations. They discovered that he'd been gathering evidence, and they silenced him permanently." The federal agent looked shaken by this revelation. "Do you have proof of Crawford's murder?" Joseph reached into a leather pouch at his side and withdrew a small object, tossing it onto the muddy ground between them. It was a silver pocket watch, engraved with initials and a date. "J.C., June 12, 1885, Agent Caldwell read aloud. "Crawford's watch, where did you get this?" "From the man who killed him," Joseph replied. "Deputy Indian Agent Marcus Thornton. Crawford's body is buried on Thornton's property, along with 2 other Bureau employees who asked too many questions." Thomas watched Agent Caldwell's face change as the implications sank in. The federal government's investigation had been based on lies told by the very criminals they should have been pursuing. Instead of hunting corrupt officials, they'd been protecting them by eliminating witnesses. "Agent Caldwell," Sarah said quietly, "this is why my father gathered evidence for so long, why he was so careful about who he trusted. The corruption isn't just about stealing money, it's about murder, cover-ups, and a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of the Bureau." Mrs. Whitmore had been listening to this exchange with growing horror. "Agent Caldwell, surely you can see that these people are telling the truth. Why would they lie about something so easily verified?" Agent Caldwell holstered his weapon completely, his official composure finally cracking. "Mrs. Whitmore, if what they're saying is accurate, then I've been used as a tool to protect murderers and thieves. My investigation has been compromised from the beginning." "More than compromised," Joseph said grimly. "Directed." Every move you've made has been guided by information provided by the same men who've been stealing from our people. They sent you after Winona because they knew she could expose them." Dr. Morrison stepped forward, his medical training making him focus on practical concerns. "Agent Caldwell, what happens now? You have 30 warriors, several civilians, and your own men all positioned for conflict. How do we prevent bloodshed while sorting out the truth?" Before Agent Caldwell could answer, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the rain. Thomas turned to see riders approaching from the direction of Town Sheriff Patterson and 6 members of the local militia, all armed and clearly expecting trouble. "Agent Caldwell," Sheriff Patterson called as he dismounted near the wagon. "We heard Indian war cries in town. Are you under attack?" The federal agent looked around at the assembled group, warriors positioned in the darkness, civilians standing in the rain, and local law enforcement arriving with weapons drawn. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge, where a single misunderstanding could trigger exactly the kind of violence everyone was trying to avoid. "Sheriff Patterson," Agent Caldwell said carefully, "the situation is more complex than we initially believed. I need you to keep your men back while we resolve some important questions." But Sheriff Patterson was already studying the group with growing alarm, his gaze fixing on Joseph Runningwolf with unmistakable hostility. "Agent Caldwell, that's a hostile Indian on our bridge with armed warriors in our woods. I'm not waiting for questions to be resolved." The sheriff raised his rifle, and Thomas saw Joseph's hand move toward his own weapon in response. In seconds, the careful negotiations would collapse into gunfire and death. That's when Thomas Bradley, 12-year-old orphan from the Millbrook workhouse, made the decision that would be remembered long after all of them were gone. He stepped directly between Sheriff Patterson's rifle and Joseph Runningwolf, his young voice cutting through the tension like a bell. "Stop!" Thomas shouted, his arms spread wide. "Sheriff Patterson, these people aren't our enemies. They're here to expose corruption and save lives. If you shoot now, you'll be protecting criminals and murdering innocent people." The sheriff's rifle wavered as he stared at the boy who'd placed himself in the line of fire. "Thomas Bradley, get out of the way. This is grown folks' business." "No, sir," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite his fear. "This is everyone's business. This is about right and wrong, and about whether we're brave enough to choose right even when it's dangerous." Mrs. Whitmore moved to stand beside Thomas, her tall frame adding weight to his words. "Sheriff Patterson, this boy has shown more courage and wisdom in the past hour than most adults show in a lifetime. Perhaps you should listen to him." Dr. Morrison joined them, creating a human barrier between the opposing forces. "Sheriff, I've examined the evidence these people carry. They're telling the truth about government corruption. If we allow violence here tonight, we'll be protecting the real criminals." For a long moment, the only sound was the drum of rain on stone and the creak of leather as armed men held their positions. Then Agent Caldwell made his choice. "Sheriff Patterson, stand down," he ordered, his federal authority overriding local jurisdiction. "These people are under federal protection while we investigate their claims." The sheriff lowered his rifle reluctantly, clearly unhappy with the decision but unwilling to challenge federal authority directly. Sarah limped forward, reaching into her shirt to withdraw the medallion once more. But this time, she lifted it over her head and held it out toward Agent Caldwell. "Agent Caldwell," she said formally, "I am Winona Blackfeather, daughter of Standing Bear, speaker for the Lakota people. I offer this sacred medallion as bond for my people's peaceful intentions and as symbol of our willingness to work with honest federal officials to expose the corruption that has harmed both our peoples." Agent Caldwell took the medallion with obvious reverence, understanding that he was holding something of immense cultural and spiritual significance. "Miss Blackfeather," he said quietly, "if you and Mr. Runningwolf are willing to cooperate with a new federal investigation, one conducted by agents who haven't been compromised by the corruption you're exposing, then I believe we can ensure justice for everyone involved. Joseph Running Wolf spoke for the first time since the confrontation had begun. Agent Caldwell, my warriors and I came here prepared to fight for our family. But we would prefer to fight for justice instead. If you can guarantee our safety while this investigation proceeds, we will share everything we know. The federal agent nodded slowly. Mr. Running Wolf, I can make that guarantee. And furthermore, I believe the evidence you carry will lead to arrests and prosecutions that extend far beyond the Bureau of Indian Affairs. As if summoned by these words of hope, the storm that had raged throughout the evening began to break. The rain lessened to a gentle shower, and gaps appeared in the clouds where stars became visible for the first time in hours. Thomas looked around at the extraordinary scene: federal agents and Lakota warriors standing peacefully together, local authorities accepting the need for justice over prejudice, and adults who'd chosen courage over comfort, despite enormous personal risk. Thomas, Sarah said, approaching him with a smile that lit up the darkness, do you understand what you've done tonight? I helped someone who needed help, Thomas replied simply. That's all. No, Sarah said, and in her voice Thomas heard echoes of her father's wisdom and her people's pride. You did something much more important. You proved that one person choosing to do right can change everything. 6 months later, Deputy Indian Agent Marcus Thornton and 7 other Bureau officials were convicted of embezzlement, murder, and conspiracy. James Crawford's body was found exactly where Joseph Running Wolf had said it would be, and the evidence he'd died trying to expose led to reforms that saved thousands of lives. Across multiple reservations, Sarah Blackfeather became the first Native American woman to testify before Congress about government corruption, speaking with the authority of someone who'd risked everything to seek justice for her people. Dr. Morrison was appointed to a federal commission investigating medical care on Indian reservations, where his combination of professional expertise and moral courage helped establish new standards for health care across the territories. Mrs. Whitmore resigned from the workhouse and opened a school where children from all backgrounds learned together. Supported by federal funding secured through Sarah's testimony, Agent Caldwell led the reformed Bureau investigation that cleaned house throughout the federal Indian bureaucracy, earning commendation for his integrity and courage. And Thomas Bradley? Thomas was adopted by Dr. Morrison and Mrs. Whitmore, who recognized that a boy capable of such courage deserved a family capable of nurturing it. He grew up to become a lawyer specializing in civil rights, always remembering the lesson he'd learned on a rain-soaked bridge in Pennsylvania, that the smallest acts of kindness can echo through history. But on the night when 30 warriors shocked the town of Millbrook, when a little orphan's choice to help a limping maid cross a river changed the course of justice itself, Thomas Bradley was simply a 12-year-old boy who'd learned that doing right mattered more than staying safe. And sometimes, that's all the courage the world needs to change. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.